When Catherine de Medici, queen, regent, and master of intrigue, died in 1589, she left behind a dynasty that had ruled France through war, faith, and fire. 10 children were born beneath her crown, some kings, some queens, some pawns of marriage politics, and a few who never lived long enough to take their first steps. From the young husband of Mary Queen of Scots to the daughters who seeded Europe's next empires, their stories chart the rise and fall of the Valois bloodline. This is the complete chronicle of Catherine de Medici's children, their births, their reigns, their deaths, and how their blood still runs through today's royal houses. In the opulent chambers of 16th century France, Catherine de Medici and Henry II presided over an empire stretched between tradition and transformation. Their marriage, arranged to cement Franco-Italian alliances, would produce heirs whose lives would span the most turbulent decades of French history. The wars of religion loomed ahead. The Protestant Reformation challenged Catholic supremacy, and the very survival of the Valois dynasty hung in the balance. Between 1544 and 1556, 10 children entered this world of ceremony and statecraft. 3 would wear the crown of France. 2 would become queens of foreign realms. Others would serve as diplomatic instruments in the great game of European politics. And some would perish before their stories could properly begin. We trace their paths from the gilded cradles of the Louvre to the scattered courts of Europe, following bloodlines that survive to this day. We begin with the boy destined to rule too soon. On January 19, 1544, at the Renaissance Palace of Fontainebleau, Catherine de Medici delivered her first surviving child. Francis, Duke of Brittany, arrived as the long-awaited heir to Henry II's throne. His birth ended years of anxiety over the Valois succession and validated Catherine's position as queen. The infant's baptism became a celebration of dynastic continuity, with Cardinal de Bourbon officiating over ceremonies that proclaimed France's future secured. Henry II, 30 years old and politically ascendant, saw in his son the promise of unbroken Valois rule. Francis's early years unfolded within the protected sphere of royal nurseries, where his health and education would be carefully managed according to the exacting standards of Renaissance kingship. At 4 years old, Francis became the centerpiece of Henry II's most ambitious diplomatic gambit. The Treaty of Haddington in 1548 arranged his betrothal to Mary Stuart, the 5-year-old Queen of Scots, creating the possibility of a unified Franco-Scottish realm under Valois rule. Mary arrived at the French court in 1548, where she and Francis grew up together as intended spouses. Their education proceeded in parallel: languages, music, dancing, and the subtle arts of courtly diplomacy. The marriage, celebrated at Notre Dame Cathedral in 1558, represented the culmination of decades of French policy toward Scotland. At 14, Francis had become husband to one of Europe's most strategically important queens, though their union would prove politically significant rather than personally transformative. The young couple's relationship remained cordial but never passionate, shaped more by duty than affection. Henry II's death in July 1559 thrust 15-year-old Francis onto the throne as Francis II. His reign immediately fell under the influence of the powerful Guise family, Mary's maternal uncles who seized control of government policy. The Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine effectively ruled France, while the young king remained a ceremonial figure. Catherine de Medici found herself marginalized, relegated to the background as her son's advisors pursued an aggressively Catholic agenda. The brief reign witnessed the beginning of religious tensions that would explode into civil war. Protestant nobles grew increasingly restive under Guy's domination, while the crown's finances deteriorated rapidly. Francis himself showed little aptitude for kingship, remaining more interested in hunting and court entertainments than the pressing business of governance. His physical frailty became increasingly apparent as political pressures mounted around his throne. Francis II's reign lasted barely 17 months. In late 1560, he developed severe ear infections that progressively worsened despite the attention of court physicians. On December 5, 1560, the 16-year-old king died at Orléans, leaving no children and a widow who would soon return to Scotland to claim her inheritance. His death marked the end of Guise' ascendancy and the beginning of Catherine de Medici's regency for her second son, Charles IX. The childless marriage between Francis and Mary dissolved the Franco-Scottish alliance that Henry II had so carefully constructed. Francis's reign, though brief, demonstrated the vulnerability of the Valois succession and the dangerous influence of court factions. His death initiated a period of regency government that would stretch across the most turbulent decades of the 16th century. Legacy: the Valois line continued through Francis's brothers, while Mary Stuart's return to Scotland severed the dynastic connection that might have united the realms. Francis II left no descendants. Born on April 2, 1545, at Fontainebleau, Elizabeth arrived as Catherine de Medici's first daughter and second surviving child. Her upbringing emphasized the cultural refinements expected of a Renaissance princess destined for diplomatic marriage. Tutors instructed her in Spanish, Italian, and Latin alongside French, while dancing masters and music teachers shaped her courtly accomplishments. Catherine personally supervised her daughter's education, understanding that Elizabeth's marriage prospects would serve French foreign policy. The princess developed particular expertise in painting and poetry, skills that would later enhance her reputation at the Spanish court. Her education in Catholic theology reflected the expectation that she would marry into one of Europe's great Catholic dynasties. By adolescence, Elizabeth had become an accomplished linguist and a graceful participant in court ceremonies, perfectly prepared for her role as a diplomatic bride. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 sealed the peace between France and Spain through Elizabeth's marriage to Philip II, the most powerful monarch in Europe. At 14, she became the third wife of a king 22 years her senior, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, and vast American territories. The proxy ceremony at Notre Dame in June 1559 preceded her departure for Spain, where she would never again see her native France. Philip II, recently widowed from his English queen Mary Tudor, sought a new alliance to secure his European position. Elizabeth's arrival at the Spanish court marked the beginning of a surprisingly successful marriage, despite the political circumstances of its arrangement. The young queen quickly adapted to Spanish court ceremonial and won Philip's genuine affection. Their relationship became one of mutual respect and eventual love, transcending its diplomatic origins. Elizabeth's reign as Queen of Spain brought French cultural influences to the austere Habsburg court. She introduced new fashions, patronized artists, and maintained correspondence with intellectuals across Europe. Her fluency in Spanish and Italian enabled her to communicate effectively with Philip's diverse courtiers, while her musical talents enlivened court entertainments. The Queen's personal piety aligned well with Spanish religious traditions, but she also brought a lighter, more aesthetically sophisticated approach to court life. She established herself as a patron of poetry and painting, commissioning works that reflected both Spanish and French artistic traditions. Her correspondence with Catherine de Medici provided a diplomatic channel between the courts, though family loyalty never superseded her adopted Spanish interests. Elizabeth's influence extended beyond cultural matters to include occasional political counsel, particularly regarding Franco-Spanish relations. Her presence at court symbolized the peace between the two great Catholic powers. Elizabeth's primary duty as queen involved providing heirs to the Spanish throne. Her first daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, born in 1566, would become one of the most significant figures in European politics, eventually ruling the Spanish Netherlands as a sovereign princess. Her second daughter, Catherine Michel, born in 1567, would marry Charles Emmanuel Fur of Savoy, extending Habsburg influence into Italy. Both daughters inherited their mother's intelligence and political acumen along with their father's dynastic claims. Elizabeth devoted herself to their early education, ensuring they acquired the linguistic and cultural skills necessary for their future roles. The births of two healthy daughters secured her position at court and demonstrated the fertility that Philip II required for dynastic continuity. Her maternal influence would shape both daughters' eventual political careers, particularly Isabella Clara Eugenia's innovative approach to governing the Netherlands. Elizabeth's third pregnancy in 1568 ended in tragedy. On October 3, 1568, she died at the age of 23 following complications in childbirth, leaving Philip II devastated and the Spanish court in mourning. Her death removed a significant diplomatic link between France and Spain, just as religious tensions across Europe were intensifying. Philip never fully recovered from her loss, and their daughters became the primary inheritors of her cultural and political legacy. Catherine Michel's marriage into the House of Savoy ensured that Elizabeth's bloodline would continue through one of Europe's most enduring dynasties. Through the Savoy connection, her descendants would eventually include the modern Italian royal family and numerous other European noble houses. Her early death prevented her from witnessing the full scope of her daughters' achievements, but her influence on their upbringing shaped their remarkable political careers. Legacy. Through her daughter, Catherine Michel of Spain, Elizabeth's bloodline flows to the modern House of Savoy and the former royal family of Italy. Claude entered the world on November 12, 1547, named for her paternal great-grandmother, Claude of France. As Catherine de Medici's second daughter, she was destined from birth to serve French diplomatic interests through marriage. Her early years unfolded during a period of relative stability for the Valois dynasty, as Henry II consolidated his reign and planned strategic alliances across Europe. Claude's education emphasized practical skills alongside courtly accomplishments, household management, diplomacy, and the complexities of governing territories. Catherine personally oversaw her daughter's preparation for eventual rule as a duchess or princess, understanding that Claude would likely govern lands far from France. The young princess developed particularly strong skills in administration and finance, qualities that would prove essential in her future role. Her upbringing reflected the practical realities of 16th century royal marriages, where personal compatibility mattered less than political utility. In 1559, 12-year-old Claude married Charles III, Duke of Lorraine, in a ceremony that strengthened French influence along the empire's eastern borders. The Duchy of Lorraine occupied a crucial strategic position between France and the Holy Roman Empire, making this alliance essential to French security. Charles III, 18 years old and newly installed as Duke, brought considerable territorial wealth and military resources to the marriage. The union represented Henry II's vision of French expansion through matrimonial diplomacy rather than military conquest. Claude's adaptation to life in Nancy, the Lorraine capital, demonstrated her diplomatic skills and practical intelligence. The marriage quickly developed into a genuine partnership, with Claude taking active roles in territorial administration. Her influence extended beyond traditional queenly duties to include participation in policy decisions affecting trade, taxation, and military preparations. The couple's collaboration established a model of shared governance that strengthened Lorraine's position within the complex politics of eastern France. Claude's tenure as Duchess of Lorraine showcased her administrative talents and political acumen. She actively participated in governing the duchy, overseeing financial reforms that stabilized Lorraine's revenues and modernized its tax collection systems. Her court at Nancy became a center of cultural activity, attracting artists and scholars from across Europe while maintaining the regional traditions that gave Lorraine its distinct identity. Claude's correspondence reveals her deep involvement in diplomatic negotiations, particularly regarding Lorraine's delicate position between French and imperial interests. She successfully mediated several territorial disputes and maintained good relations with both neighboring France and the Holy Roman Empire. Her governance style emphasized consultation with local nobles and merchants, building consensus around policies that promoted economic development. The Duchess also championed educational initiatives, founding schools and supporting libraries that enhanced Lorraine's intellectual reputation. Her practical approach to statecraft earned respect from subjects and foreign diplomats alike. Claude's 9 children provided the duchy with abundant heirs and created extensive marriage connections across European nobility. Her eldest son, Henry II of Lorraine, would inherit the duchy and continue its independent traditions. Her daughters married into prominent German and Italian families, extending Lorraine's diplomatic reach throughout the continent. Claude devoted considerable attention to her children's education, ensuring they acquired the multilingual skills and cultural sophistication necessary for their future roles. Her court became renowned for its musical performances and artistic patronage, with Claude personally commissioning paintings and sculptures that celebrated both Valois and Lorraine heritage. She established workshops for tapestry production and metalworking that enhanced the duchy's economic base while creating luxury goods for European markets. Her cultural initiatives included support for literature and historical writing, preserving regional traditions while embracing Renaissance innovations. The Duchess's patronage created a cultural flowering that distinguished Nancy as one of Europe's most sophisticated provincial courts. Claude's death on February 21, 1575, ended 28 years of distinguished service as Duchess of Lorraine. Her legacy lived on through her descendants, who would eventually unite the houses of Lorraine and Habsburg through strategic marriages. Her bloodline would produce Francis the Holy Roman Emperor, whose marriage to Maria Theresa created the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty that ruled Austria until 1918. Through this connection, Claude's genes passed to virtually every major European royal family, including the current British royal family and numerous continental dynasties. Her administrative innovations in Lorraine provided a foundation for the duchy's continued prosperity and eventual integration into the Holy Roman Empire. The cultural traditions she established at Nancy influenced court life throughout eastern France and the German territories. Her diplomatic legacy helped maintain Lorraine's independence for another century, demonstrating the effectiveness of her careful balancing between French and imperial interests. Claude's descendants continued her tradition of effective governance and strategic marriage alliances. Legacy: Claude's descendants became the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, providing emperors for Austria and ancestors for modern European royal families, including the British royal family. Louis arrived on February 3, 1549, at Fontainebleau, bearing the prestigious title Duke of Orléans that traditionally belonged to French royal younger sons. His birth provided Henry II with a valuable spare heir, following the successful arrival of Francis and preceding the future Charles IX by just over a year. The infant's baptism celebrated another Valois prince to strengthen dynastic security, with ceremonies that emphasized his potential role in diplomatic marriages or territorial governance. Catherine de Medici's successful delivery of a healthy son further solidified her position as queen and demonstrated the fertility that secured royal succession. Louis's early months unfolded within the protected environment of royal nurseries, attended by wet nurses and physicians who monitored his development according to contemporary medical practices. However, the infant Duke of Orléans would not survive to see his first birthday. On October 24, 1550, barely 8 months old, Louis died of causes typical of 16th century infant mortality. His death saddened the royal family but did not threaten dynastic stability, given the survival of his elder brother Francis and the approaching birth of Charles. The title Duke of Orléans would later pass to other royal children, maintaining its significance within the Valois family structure despite this early tragedy. Legacy: Louis died in infancy and left no issue. The title Duke of Orléans would later be recycled within the royal family. Charles Maximilien entered the world on June 27, 1550, at the Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, destined to become France's spare heir following his elder brother Francis. His early childhood proceeded during the final years of Henry II's reign, surrounded by the Renaissance splendor of the French court. The unexpected death of Francis II in December 1560 thrust 10-year-old Charles onto the throne as Charles IX, initiating a regency period dominated by his mother, Catherine de Medici. The young king's education emphasized classical learning, military training, and the complex arts of statecraft, though his personality showed early signs of instability and violent temperament. Catherine carefully managed his public appearances while retaining actual control over government policy, using her son's authority to legitimize her own political decisions. Charles's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of mounting religious tensions as Protestant and Catholic factions competed for influence over the crown. His tutors included some of France's finest scholars, but political pressures increasingly shaped his daily routine and personal development. Charles IX's reign coincided with the eruption of France's devastating wars of religion, as Catholic and Protestant factions tore the kingdom apart through armed conflict. His majority, declared in 1563 at age 13, marked the formal end of Catherine's regency, but continued her practical control over royal policy. The young king struggled to balance competing religious demands while maintaining royal authority against increasingly powerful noble factions. His temperament proved ill-suited to the diplomatic subtleties required for religious reconciliation, often favoring military solutions over negotiated settlements. The First and Second Wars of Religion during his early reign demonstrated the crown's inability to impose lasting peace through force alone. Charles's relationship with prominent Protestant leaders like Admiral Coligny created tensions within his own court, as Catholic extremists suspected royal sympathy for heretical doctrines. His participation in royal progresses across France exposed him to the devastating effects of religious warfare on ordinary subjects, shaping his increasingly pessimistic worldview. The king's growing isolation from both religious factions undermined royal prestige and effective governance. In 1570, Charles IX married Elizabeth of Austria, daughter of Emperor Maximilian II, in a ceremony designed to strengthen Catholic alliances while providing royal heirs. The 20-year-old king wed his 15-year-old bride following complex negotiations that balanced French independence with Habsburg connections. Elizabeth's arrival at the French court brought Austrian influences and reinforced Catholic elements within royal circles, though she remained largely excluded from political affairs. The marriage served diplomatic purposes more than personal happiness, as Charles's increasingly erratic behavior strained their relationship from its beginning. Elizabeth's adaptation to French court life proved challenging given the ongoing religious conflicts and her husband's volatile temperament. The Queen's strong Catholic convictions aligned with conservative court factions, but occasionally conflicted with Catherine de Medici's more pragmatic approach to religious policy. Their relationship produced one daughter, but failed to provide the male heirs necessary for dynastic continuity. Charles's deteriorating mental state increasingly isolated Elizabeth within the court, limiting her influence over royal policy and her husband's behavior. Charles IX's only legitimate child, Marie Elizabeth, born in 1572, provided brief dynastic hope before her death in childhood ended his direct line. His relationships with several mistresses produced acknowledged illegitimate children, including a son who would briefly continue the Angoulême branch of royal bastards. The king's paternal duties conflicted with his deteriorating psychological condition, as religious pressures and political failures took increasing tolls on his mental stability. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572 marked the nadir of his reign, as thousands of Protestants died in religiously motivated violence that Charles allegedly authorized under extreme pressure from court Catholics. His complicity in the massacre haunted his final years, contributing to periods of deep depression and violent outbursts that alarmed court observers. Charles's relationship with his surviving daughter became strained as his behavior grew increasingly unpredictable and potentially dangerous. His inability to control religious extremism within his own kingdom undermined royal authority and personal confidence. The king's declining health paralleled France's political disintegration during the final years of his troubled reign. Charles IX's death on May 30, 1574, at Vincennes, ended one of the most troubled reigns in French history. At 23, he succumbed to tuberculosis, complicated by psychological distress and possibly poisoning, though contemporary accounts remain contradictory regarding specific causes. His death, without surviving legitimate male heirs, transferred the crown to his brother Henry III, continuing the Valois succession through Catherine de Medici's remaining sons. The late king's illegitimate children briefly maintained the Angoulême line but never challenged the main dynastic succession. Charles's widow Elizabeth returned to Austria, where she eventually remarried and disappeared from French political significance. His reign's legacy included the devastating religious wars that would continue under his successor and the precedent of royal involvement in religiously motivated massacres. The psychological toll of kingship during France's religious crisis demonstrated the personal costs of ruling during periods of extreme social division. Charles IX's failure to resolve religious conflicts through either tolerance or suppression established patterns that would plague his brother's subsequent reign. Legacy: Charles IX died without legitimate male heirs, ending his direct line. His illegitimate Angoulême branch survived briefly among the nobility, but produced no lasting dynasty. Alexandre Edouard entered the world on September 19, 1551, at Fontainebleau, destined to become Catherine de Medici's most intellectually gifted and personally beloved child. Named initially Duke of Anjou, he quickly distinguished himself through exceptional academic abilities and sophisticated cultural interests that impressed tutors and courtiers alike. Catherine recognized his superior intelligence early and invested heavily in his education, providing instruction in classical languages, philosophy, literature, and the fine arts. His childhood unfolded during the relative stability of Henry II's final years, allowing for comprehensive intellectual development without the immediate pressures of succession. The young prince displayed remarkable linguistic talents, eventually mastering Latin, Greek, Italian, and Spanish alongside his native French. His early interest in poetry and music reflected the Renaissance ideals that shaped French court culture, while his quick grasp of political concepts suggested natural aptitude for statecraft. Catherine's obvious favoritism toward Henry created some tension with his siblings, but ensured he received the most thorough preparation for royal responsibilities. His personality combined intellectual sophistication with artistic sensibility, marking him as uniquely suited for Renaissance kingship. In 1573, 21-year-old Henry achieved one of the most remarkable diplomatic coups of the 16th century when the Polish Diet elected him King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. This unprecedented honor reflected both his personal abilities and Catherine de Medici's skillful diplomacy in promoting his candidacy against Habsburg and other rivals. The Polish crown offered Henry valuable experience in elective monarchy and constitutional government, systems completely different from French absolutist traditions. His brief reign in Poland demonstrated considerable political skill as he navigated the complex religious and ethnic divisions within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Henry's court at Krakow became a center of Renaissance culture, attracting scholars and artists from across Europe while maintaining the religious tolerance that characterized Polish political life. His adaptation to Polish customs and his respect for constitutional limitations impressed subjects and foreign observers, suggesting maturity beyond his years. However, the sudden death of Charles IX in May 1574 created an irresistible opportunity to claim the more prestigious French throne. Henry's dramatic flight from Poland in June 1574 scandalized the Polish nobility but secured his succession to his ancestral kingdom. Henry III's return to France in 1574 marked the beginning of the most culturally sophisticated but politically challenged reign of the Valois dynasty. His coronation at Reims Cathedral emphasized traditional legitimacy, while his court reforms introduced new standards of etiquette and artistic patronage that revolutionized French court life. The new king's intellectual interests shaped policy initiatives in education, law, and administration, though religious warfare increasingly dominated governmental attention. Henry's marriage to Louise of Lorraine in 1575 provided personal happiness but failed to produce the male heirs essential for dynastic continuity. His reign witnessed the most refined flowering of French Renaissance culture, with royal patronage supporting poetry, painting, music, and architecture at unprecedented levels. The king's personal style blended masculine authority with aesthetic refinement, creating new models of royal presentation that influenced European court culture for generations. However, his religious policies satisfied neither Catholic nor Protestant extremists, leaving the crown isolated between increasingly violent factions. Henry's attempts at administrative reform foundered against the financial and political chaos created by ongoing religious warfare. The later years of Henry III's reign descended into chaos as the Catholic League challenged royal authority and Protestant resistance continued across southern France. The king's brother Francois, Duke of Anjou, complicated politics through his independent campaigns in the Netherlands and his courtship of Elizabeth I of England, creating diplomatic tensions that weakened royal position. Henry's relationship with the League leadership, particularly the Duke of Guise, deteriorated as extremist Catholics demanded policies incompatible with royal independence and national unity. The Day of the Barricades in May 1588 forced Henry to flee Paris as League supporters seized control of the capital, demonstrating the crown's military weakness and political isolation. His desperate decision to assassinate the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal of Guise, in December 1588 shocked Catholic opinion and united League opposition against royal authority. The king's alliance with Protestant leader Henry of Navarre represented pragmatic politics, but further alienated Catholic extremists throughout the kingdom. France effectively disintegrated into competing zones of religious and political control, with royal authority reduced to areas controlled by Henry's remaining military forces. On August 1, 1589, Jacques Clément, a Dominican friar and League supporter, assassinated Henry III at Saint-Cloud during the siege of Paris. The 37-year-old king died from stab wounds inflicted by a religious fanatic who viewed regicide as divinely commanded punishment for the Guise murders. Henry's death without children ended the Valois dynasty that had ruled France since 1328, transferring the crown to his brother-in-law and designated heir, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader who would become Henry IV. The last Valois king's assassination demonstrated the complete breakdown of religious and political authority that characterized late 16th century France. His death sparked renewed civil warfare as Catholic extremists refused to accept Protestant succession, and foreign powers intervened to support competing claimants. Henry III's cultural achievements, his patronage of arts and letters, his sophisticated court ceremonies, and his administrative innovations were overshadowed by his political failures and violent end. The extinction of the Valois male line represented more than dynastic change. It marked the end of an era in French history and the beginning of the Bourbon ascendancy that would dominate France for the next 2 centuries. Legacy. Henry III died childless, ending the Valois royal line. The French crown passed to Henry of Navarre, initiating the Bourbon dynasty. Marguerite entered the world on May 14, 1553, at the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, destined to become the most intellectually accomplished and politically independent of Catherine de Medici's daughters. Her education emphasized classical literature, philosophy, and modern languages, producing a young woman whose scholarly abilities impressed the finest minds of Renaissance Europe. The princess mastered Latin and Greek alongside contemporary vernacular languages, while her study of history and political theory prepared her for the complex diplomatic role expected of royal daughters. Catherine personally supervised Margaret's intellectual development, recognizing her exceptional abilities and strong-willed personality that would require careful management. Her upbringing unfolded within the sophisticated cultural environment of the French court, where Renaissance humanism flourished under royal patronage. The young princess participated in court ceremonies and diplomatic receptions that provided practical training in statecraft and international relations. Her beauty and intelligence made her a valuable asset in Catherine's matrimonial diplomacy, though her independent spirit would ultimately complicate family political strategies. Margaret's adolescence coincided with the intensification of religious conflicts that would shape her adult political choices. Margaret's marriage to Henry of Navarre on August 18, 1572, represented Catherine de Medici's most ambitious attempt at religious reconciliation through dynastic alliance. The wedding united France's premier Catholic princess with the leading Protestant prince, symbolically bridging the religious divide that was tearing the kingdom apart. The ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral brought together thousands of Protestant and Catholic nobles in an unprecedented display of interfaith cooperation, though this fragile unity would shatter within days during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The 19-year-old bride and 18-year-old groom entered their marriage as political partners rather than romantic lovers, each understanding their union's strategic importance for their respective religious communities. Henry's Protestant convictions and Margaret's Catholic faith created permanent tension within their household, though both maintained public respect for their confessional differences. The early years of their marriage unfolded against the backdrop of continuing religious warfare as their alliance failed to achieve the reconciliation Catherine had envisioned. Margaret's position as Queen of Navarre provided her with independent political standing that she would use to pursue her own interests when the marriage deteriorated. The breakdown of Margaret's marriage coincided with her increasing involvement in court intrigues and political conspiracies that alarmed both her brothers and her husband. Her relationships with various courtiers and nobles created scandals that damaged her reputation while providing ammunition for political enemies who questioned her loyalty to crown and spouse. The couple's inability to produce children undermined the marriage's political value and created additional pressures that drove them toward permanent separation. Margaret's participation in plots against Henry III led to periods of house arrest and exile that demonstrated the limits of royal protection when family interests conflicted. Her captivity at various chateaux failed to diminish her political activities as she maintained correspondence networks that kept her informed of court developments and international affairs. The annulment of her marriage in 1599 freed both parties to pursue other alliances, with Henry marrying Marie de Medici, while Margaret retained her royal titles and independent income. Her experience of political imprisonment and marital failure produced a cynical realism about power relationships that informed her later writings and political choices. Margaret's survival of these trials demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Margaret's final decades witnessed her transformation from political participant to historical chronicler as she channeled her experiences into literary works that preserved Valois court culture for posterity. Her memoirs, begun during her periods of captivity and completed in her later years, provided unprecedented insights into 16th century court life, political intrigue, and the personal costs of dynastic service. The former Queen's salon in Paris became a gathering place for intellectuals, poets, and political figures who appreciated her wit, learning, and connections to the previous era's great events. Her patronage of writers and artists continued family traditions while establishing her reputation as an independent cultural force rather than merely a displaced royal relative. Margaret's correspondence reveals ongoing interest in political developments and occasional attempts to influence policy through her connections with Henry IV and other former associates. Her religious life remained conventionally Catholic despite her earlier conflicts with church authorities over her marriage and personal conduct. The aging princess's financial difficulties reflected the reduced circumstances of displaced royalty, though she maintained dignity and cultural influence despite economic constraints. Her death on March 27, 1615, ended the last direct connection to the great era of Valois court culture. Margaret of Valois' historical significance extends far beyond her political failures and personal scandals to encompass her pioneering role as a female memoirist and cultural patron. Her writings preserve invaluable details about Renaissance court life, diplomatic practices, and the human dimensions of 16th century political conflicts that would otherwise have been lost to history. The former Queen's literary achievements demonstrated that royal women could transcend their traditional roles as matrimonial instruments to become independent intellectual forces. Her influence on French literature included both her own compositions and her patronage of contemporary writers who benefited from her protection and encouragement. Margaret's political reputation, while damaged by her conflicts with family members and marital failures, reflected the impossible pressures placed on royal women who were expected to subordinate personal desires to dynastic requirements. Her resistance to these constraints and her ultimate creation of an independent life inspired later generations of aristocratic women seeking alternatives to purely matrimonial careers. The preservation of her correspondence and memoirs provides historians with rare female perspectives on major political events and court culture. Her legacy challenges traditional narratives that marginalize women's roles in Renaissance politics and culture. Legacy. Margaret died childless, but her memoirs preserve crucial insights into Valois court culture and the political challenges faced by Renaissance royal women. Hercule Francois entered the world on March 18, 1555, at Fontainebleau, as Catherine de Medici's youngest surviving son and final opportunity for Valois dynastic expansion. His birth followed the tragic early death of his brother Louis and preceded the brief lives of the twins Victtoire and Jeanne, marking him as the dynasty's last hope for establishing cadet branches. The prince's childhood unfolded during the intensifying religious conflicts that would define his generation's political challenges and opportunities. His education emphasized military training and diplomatic skills, preparing him for the territorial ambitions that younger sons traditionally pursued through conquest or strategic marriage. Catherine invested considerable attention in Francois' development, recognizing his potential value in international negotiations and territorial expansion. His personality displayed the characteristic Valois combination of intelligence and ambition, though his shorter stature and less commanding presence distinguished him from his more physically impressive brothers. The young prince's court upbringing exposed him to the sophisticated cultural environment that shaped Valois' expectations of royal behavior and achievement. His position as youngest son provided certain freedoms from succession pressures while creating pressures to establish independent greatness through personal achievement. Francois' adult political career began with his involvement in the religious conflicts that plagued his brother Henry III's reign, initially supporting Protestant causes before shifting toward more opportunistic alliances. His participation in various conspiracies and military campaigns reflected both genuine political convictions and personal ambition to establish independent authority beyond the shadow of his more successful siblings. The prince's relationship with Henry III remained complex, combining family loyalty with professional rivalry as Francois pursued territorial and matrimonial opportunities that sometimes conflicted with royal policy. His brief military successes in capturing certain strongholds demonstrated competent tactical abilities, though his strategic vision often exceeded his practical resources. Francois's political allegiances shifted according to perceived advantages, creating reputation issues that complicated his diplomatic relationships with both foreign courts and domestic factions. His participation in the so-called malcontents movement reflected broader noble dissatisfaction with royal centralization, though Francois's personal motivations remained primarily dynastic rather than ideological. The prince's efforts to establish independent territorial control in Flanders and other regions represented traditional cadet ambitions updated for 16th century political realities. His rivalry with other ambitious nobles limited his effectiveness in building lasting political coalitions. Francois's most famous diplomatic adventure involved his protracted courtship of Elizabeth I of England, a relationship that dominated European politics for several years, while ultimately failing to achieve marriage or lasting alliance. The correspondence between the 23-year-old French prince and the 46-year-old English queen revealed genuine affection alongside obvious political calculations on both sides. Elizabeth's encouragement of Francois's suit served her diplomatic purposes in balancing French and Spanish influences while maintaining English independence, though her ultimate refusal to marry reflected practical considerations about religious differences and political complications. Francois's visits to the English court created international sensations and provided him with valuable diplomatic experience, though the relationship's failure left him without the territorial and financial resources that marriage to Elizabeth would have provided. The elaborate courtship rituals and gift exchanges between the couple demonstrated Renaissance diplomatic sophistication while highlighting the personal costs of matrimonial politics for royal participants. English court observers noted Francois's intelligence and cultural refinement, though his physical appearance and religious background created obstacles to popular acceptance. The end of the courtship in 1582 forced Francois to seek alternative paths to territorial acquisition and political prominence. The failed English marriage represented his best opportunity for establishing lasting dynastic significance. Following his English disappointment, Francois turned toward the Netherlands, where Protestant rebels offered him sovereignty over territories wrested from Spanish control through armed resistance. His acceptance of the title Duke of Brabant and Lord of the Netherlands in 1582 represented both personal ambition and broader French strategy to weaken Spanish power in northern Europe. The military campaigns that followed demonstrated Francois's courage and tactical competence while revealing the limitations of his resources and political support. His efforts to govern Protestant territories as a Catholic prince created religious tensions that undermined his authority and limited his effectiveness as a leader of anti-Spanish resistance. The French government's reluctant support for Francois's Netherlands adventure reflected Henry III's desire to embarrass Spain without committing royal resources to potentially disastrous military campaigns. Francois's relationships with Dutch Protestant leaders remained cordial but never achieved the trust necessary for effective political collaboration in such a religiously charged environment. His military successes in capturing certain strategic positions were overshadowed by his inability to maintain control or build lasting alliances with local populations. The prince's declining health during the Netherlands campaigns limited his ability to provide sustained leadership for the anti-Spanish cause. Francois died on June 10, 1584, at Château-Thierry, at age 29, unmarried and without legitimate heirs to continue his line. His death from tuberculosis ended the last realistic hope for Valois dynastic expansion and left Henry III without surviving brothers to provide alternate succession possibilities. The prince's failure to establish lasting territorial control or advantageous marriage alliances reflected both personal limitations and the broader challenges facing cadet princes in an era of religious warfare and shifting political alignments. His death eliminated a potential alternative to Henry III's childless succession, concentrating Valois hopes entirely on the king's ability to produce heirs with Louise of Lorraine. Francois's political legacy included his contribution to anti-Spanish resistance in the Netherlands and his role in Franco-English diplomatic relations during the crucial 1580s. His personal effects and correspondence reveal a cultured Renaissance prince whose intellectual interests extended beyond military and political affairs to include literature and the arts. The prince's unfulfilled potential symbolized the broader tragedy of the Valois dynasty's gradual extinction through premature deaths and childless marriages. His contemporaries remembered him as a charismatic but ultimately unsuccessful figure whose ambitions exceeded his achievements. The end of Francois' line marked another step toward the inevitable extinction of Catherine de Medici's male descendants. Legacy? Francois died unmarried and childless, ending his potential to establish a cadet branch of the Valois dynasty. His death brought the dynasty closer to extinction. The year 1556 brought Catherine de Medici face to face with the harsh realities of 16th century childbirth when she delivered twin daughters on June 24th at Fontainebleau. Victtoire and Jeanne arrived during a particularly difficult labor that nearly claimed Catherine's life and left Henry II devastated by the prospect of losing his queen. The 37-year-old Catherine's pregnancy had proceeded normally until the final stages, when complications during delivery created life-threatening bleeding and exhaustion that court physicians struggled to control. Henry II maintained a bedside vigil as his wife fought for survival, while the twin infants received emergency baptisms reflecting contemporary concerns about unbaptized souls dying in infancy. The twins' brief lives unfolded within the intensive care protocols of royal nurseries, where wet nurses and physicians monitored their development according to the most advanced medical knowledge available to 16th century practitioners. Victoire showed slightly stronger constitution than her sister Jeanne, though both infants displayed the fragility common among premature or difficult births. Catherine's recovery required several weeks of careful nursing, during which she could provide only limited direct care for her daughters while regaining strength lost during their traumatic delivery. Henry II's emotional investment in the twins reflected both personal affection and dynastic anxiety, as their survival would provide additional diplomatic resources for future marriage alliances. The crisis deepened in August when both twins began displaying symptoms of respiratory distress and feeding difficulties that contemporary medicine could not effectively address. Victoire died first, followed within days by Jeanne, ending their brief existence before they could make any significant impact on court life or dynastic planning. Their deaths devastated Catherine and Henry, who had invested considerable emotional energy in their survival after the traumatic circumstances of their birth. The twin tragedy demonstrated the precarious nature of royal succession planning, where even successfully delivered children might not survive the medical challenges of early infancy. Court ceremonies marking their deaths emphasized the theological importance of their baptisms, while acknowledging the profound grief that such losses created within royal families. The end of the twins' lives marked Catherine's final childbearing experience and closed the dynasty's reproductive chapter on a note of profound sadness that would influence her subsequent devotion to her surviving children's welfare and political success. Legacy: Victoire and Jeanne died in infancy, leaving no descendants and representing the fragility of royal succession in the 16th century. When the assassin's blade found Henry III at Saint-Cloud in 1589, it severed more than a life. It ended a dynasty that had shaped France for over 2 centuries. The Valois line, which had weathered the 100 Years' War, the Italian campaigns, and the religious convulsions of the Reformation, finally succumbed to the very conflicts it had failed to resolve. Catherine de Medici's 10 children, born to rule and to serve the crown's diplomatic needs, had ultimately proved unable to perpetuate their father's lineage. Yet Catherine's genetic legacy did not perish with her. Through the marriages of Elizabeth and Claude, her bloodline scattered across Europe's royal houses like seeds on the wind. Elizabeth's daughter, Catherine Michel, carried Valois genes to the House of Savoy, where they eventually reached the Italian royal family and spread throughout European nobility. Claude's descendants founded the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, providing emperors for Austria and ancestors for countless noble families, including the current British royal line through Queen Victoria's maternal lineage. The irony of Catherine de Medici's legacy lies in its geographical distribution. The queen who fought so desperately to preserve French royal power inadvertently ensured that her bloodline would survive through foreign courts rather than her native realm. Her daughter's strategic marriages, intended to strengthen France through international alliances, instead became the vehicles for preserving Valois genetic heritage when the male line failed. The very diplomatic tools that should have secured the dynasty's dominance became the means of its dispersal. Today, tourists visiting European palaces encounter portraits of monarchs whose veins carry traces of Catherine de Medici, Lorraine, de Medici blood. The woman who never successfully unified France under her children's rule ultimately achieved a different kind of victory, genetic immortality through the scattered crowns of Europe. In the end, Catherine's throne was lost, but her children still rule on in blood.